The Colorado River roared beneath the rickety wooden bridge as Delilah Vaughn clung desperately to the splintered railing, her knuckles white with effort, her heart pounding like a stampede through her chest. The three men who had ambushed her on her way back to town now circled her like vultures, their faces twisted with malice in the dying light of the setting sun. "Please," she begged, her voice nearly lost to the rushing water below. "I've done nothing to you." "Your pa owes a debt," growled the tallest of the three, a man with a scar running from his right eye to his jaw. "And since he ain't around to pay it, you're gonna have to settle up instead." The year was 1878, and the wild territory of Arizona was a lawless place where justice often came from the barrel of a gun rather than a courtroom. Delilah had known this her entire life, but never had she expected to face the brutal reality of frontier justice herself. "My father is dead," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Whatever quarrel you had with him died with him." The scarred man laughed, a hollow sound that sent chills down Delilah's spine. "That ain't how it works, Miss Vaughn. Your pa borrowed money to keep that little dress shop of yours afloat. Now it's time to collect with interest." "I can pay you," Delilah said, backing away as they advanced. "I just need time. The shop is doing well now." "We don't want your money anymore," said the second man, shorter but broader than the first. "Boss wants to send a message. Can't have folks thinking they can borrow and not pay." Delilah felt the railing press against her back. There was nowhere left to run. The Colorado stretched out beneath her, its waters dark and threatening in the fading light. She knew she couldn't swim well enough to survive its powerful current, especially not in her heavy skirts. "Throw her in," ordered the scarred man. "Let the river take care of her." The men lunged forward, grabbing Delilah's arms. She screamed and fought, but they were too strong. They lifted her struggling body, her boots kicking uselessly in the air as they swung her toward the edge of the bridge. 1. The scarred man began counting. 2. The second man joined in. Delilah closed her eyes, bracing for the icy shock of the water. But the count of 3 never came. Instead, there was a thunderous sound of hoofbeats pounding across the wooden planks of the bridge. Delilah's eyes flew open just in time to see a tall figure leap from a chestnut stallion, tackling the scarred man with such force that both men crashed into the railing. "Let her go!" the newcomer roared, his voice carrying over the sound of the river. The other 2 men hesitated, momentarily stunned by the unexpected interruption. It was all the time Delilah needed. She twisted free from their loosened grip and dropped to the planks of the bridge, scrambling away from the edge. "Who the hell are you?" demanded the scarred man as he struggled to his feet. "Wyatt Xavier," the stranger replied, his stance wide and ready as he positioned himself between Delilah and her attackers. "And I reckon you boys ought to be on your way before this gets ugly." Delilah took her first good look at her rescuer. He stood tall in worn leather boots and faded denim, a revolver holstered at his hip and a weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His face was tanned from the sun, with a strong jaw shadowed by stubble that suggested days on the trail. "This ain't your business, cowboy," said the scarred man, drawing a knife from his belt. "You made it my business when you put hands on a lady," Wyatt replied, his voice calm despite the tension in his shoulders. What happened next occurred so quickly that Delilah would later struggle to piece it together clearly. The scarred man lunged with his knife, but Wyatt was faster, drawing his revolver in a smooth motion that spoke of years of practice. He didn't fire, though. Instead, he used the heavy handle to strike the man's wrist, sending the knife clattering to the bridge. The other 2 men rushed forward together. Wyatt met the first with a powerful right hook that sent him staggering, but the second managed to land a blow to Wyatt's ribs that made him grunt in pain. As they grappled near the edge of the bridge, the railing, already weakened with age and poor maintenance, gave way with a splintering crack. Delilah watched in horror as all three men tumbled over the edge and into the churning waters below. "No!" she cried, rushing to the broken railing. Below, she could see them struggling against the current. The scarred man and his companion were fighting to reach the shore, but Wyatt was swimming straight for the third man, who was flailing helplessly, clearly unable to swim. Delilah watched, heart in her throat, as Wyatt reached the drowning man and fought to keep both their heads above water. The current was brutal, sweeping them downstream as Wyatt battled both the river and the panicked man in his grasp. Without thinking, Delilah hiked up her skirts and ran to the end of the bridge, following the riverbank as she tried to keep Wyatt in sight. She saw him finally manage to drag the man toward a fallen tree that extended into the water. The man grabbed onto the branches, coughing and sputtering, but Wyatt didn't join him. Instead, he pushed away from the tree and swam back into the current. At first, Delilah couldn't understand why, until she saw the scarred man still struggling in the water, now being pulled toward a section of dangerous rapids. "He's going after him," Delilah whispered in disbelief. Wyatt dove beneath the surface, disappearing from view for heart-stopping seconds before resurfacing beside the scarred man. The two appeared to struggle briefly whether the man was fighting Wyatt or simply panicking. Delilah couldn't tell. Then both vanished beneath the water again. Delilah ran faster, her lungs burning, her skirts heavy with the moisture from the riverbank. When she rounded a bend in the river, she spotted them. Wyatt had somehow managed to drag the scarred man to a shallow section of the river. Both men lay on the rocky shore, gasping for breath. As Delilah approached, she saw the scarred man push himself to his feet, stumbling away from Wyatt. For a moment, it looked as though he might attack again, but instead he simply turned and staggered into the trees, disappearing from sight. Delilah rushed to Wyatt's side. He lay on his back, chest heaving, his clothes soaked and his hat long gone to the river. "Are you all right?" she asked, kneeling beside him. Wyatt opened his eyes, revealing a startling shade of blue that reminded Delilah of the summer sky. "Been better," he managed between breaths. "But I'll live." He tried to sit up, wincing as he did so. "Don't move," Delilah said, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You might be hurt." "Just a few bruises," Wyatt insisted, though the grimace on his face suggested otherwise. "Nothing that won't heal." He looked at her properly for the first time, his gaze intense. "Are you hurt, miss?" "Vaughn," she supplied. "Delilah Vaughn, and no, thanks to you, I'm unharmed." Wyatt nodded, seemingly satisfied with her answer. With a determined grunt, he pushed himself into a sitting position despite Delilah's protests. "Those men," he said. "Why were they after you?" Delilah hesitated, unsure how much to share with this stranger who had risked his life to save hers. "They claimed my father owed them money. He passed away 6 months ago, leaving me his dress shop in town. And they thought throwing you in the river was fair collection." Wyatt's voice hardened with anger. "They said their boss wanted to send a message." Delilah shivered, suddenly very aware of how close she had come to death. "I don't even know who their boss is." Wyatt's expression darkened. "I have my suspicions." He looked around, taking in their surroundings. "We should get moving. Those men might come back with reinforcements and night's falling fast." "My horse is still at the bridge," Delilah said, realizing the problem. "Mine too, if he hasn't bolted." Wyatt stood slowly, water streaming from his clothes. He offered Delilah his hand. "We'll head back together. Safety in numbers." Delilah took his hand, noting the calluses that spoke of a life of hard work. "Thank you, Mr. Xavier. I don't know how I'll ever repay you for what you did today." A small smile softened his features. "Call me Wyatt, "And no repayment necessary, Miss Vaughn. I couldn't very well ride past and let those men harm you." As they began the walk back to the bridge, Delilah found herself studying Wyatt Xavier from the corner of her eye. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in dangerous situations, yet there was nothing threatening about his presence. If anything, she felt safer with him at her side than she had in the 6 months since her father's death had left her alone in the world. "You're not from around here," she observed. It wasn't a question. Wyatt shook his head. "Just passing through. Was heading to Willow Creek to look for work." "Willow Creek? That's where my shop is," Delilah said, surprised by the coincidence. "Small world," Wyatt commented. "What kind of shop, if you don't mind my asking?" "A dress shop. My mother taught me to sew before she passed, and my father set up the shop for me 5 years ago. He ran the business side of things." Delilah sighed. "I've been managing on my own since he died, but it hasn't been easy." Wyatt nodded thoughtfully. "And these men, they said your father borrowed money to keep the shop going, apparently, though he never mentioned any loans to me." Delilah frowned. "My father wasn't perfect, but he was honest. If he borrowed money, he would have intended to pay it back." "I believe you," Wyatt said simply. They walked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the rush of the river beside them and the occasional call of a bird settling in for the night. The sky had darkened to a deep indigo, stars beginning to appear like diamonds scattered across velvet. As they approached the bridge, Delilah was relieved to see both their horses still waiting. Her mare, Penny, nickered softly at her approach. Wyatt's chestnut stallion stood alert, ears pricked forward. "Looks like Thunder decided to stick around," Wyatt said, approaching his horse and running a hand along its neck. "Good boy." "Your horse is named Thunder?" Delilah asked, untying Penny's reins from the hitching post. "Seemed fitting," Wyatt replied with a small smile. "He makes enough noise when he runs." Wyatt helped Delilah mount her horse before swinging himself into his own saddle, his movements slightly stiff from his ordeal in the river. His clothes were still soaked, clinging uncomfortably to his skin. "You'll catch your death riding in wet clothes," Delilah said, concern coloring her voice. "My shop isn't far from the edge of town. You could come dry off, at least." Wyatt hesitated, clearly weighing his options. "Much obliged for the offer, Miss Vaughn, if it wouldn't be an imposition." "After what you did today, it's the least I can do." Delilah guided Penny onto the road that led to town. "Besides, I'd feel better not riding alone. Those men could still be out there." Wyatt nodded, urging Thunder forward to ride alongside her. "All the more reason for me to see you safely home." The ride to Willow Creek took less than an hour, the road illuminated by the rising moon. The town was small but prosperous, situated along a major cattle trail. As they rode down the main street, Delilah could see lamplight glowing in windows and hear the muted sounds of piano music and laughter coming from the saloon. She led Wyatt to a modest 2-story building on a side street. The ground floor featured large windows displaying dress forms adorned with fashionable gowns. A sign above the door read, "Vaughn's Dressmaking and Alterations." "Home sweet home," Delilah said, dismounting. "The shop is downstairs and I live in the rooms above." Wyatt tied Thunder to the hitching post and followed Delilah to the back entrance. She unlocked the door and lit a lamp, revealing a neat workspace with a large cutting table, several sewing machines, and shelves stocked with fabrics in a rainbow of colors and textures. "It's not much," she said, suddenly self-conscious about the humble shop. "It's impressive," Wyatt replied genuinely. "You do all this work yourself?" "I have a girl who helps with the simpler tasks a few days a week, but yes, most of it falls to me." Delilah hung her bonnet on a hook by the door and gestured toward a narrow staircase. My living quarters are upstairs. I can find you some dry clothes. My father's things are still here." Wyatt followed her up the stairs to a small but comfortable apartment. The main room served as both kitchen and parlor, with 2 doors leading to what Wyatt assumed were bedrooms. "Wait here," Delilah said, disappearing through one of the doors. She returned moments later with a bundle of men's clothing. "These should fit. They might be a bit short in the arms and legs. My father wasn't as tall as you, but they're dry." "Thank you," Wyatt said, taking the clothes. "Where can I?" "Oh," Delilah blushed slightly. "You can use my father's room to change." She pointed to the second door. "I'll make us some tea while you get dried off." Wyatt nodded and retreated to the bedroom, closing the door behind him. The room was sparse but neat, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small mirror. Wyatt peeled off his wet clothes, using a towel Delilah had provided to dry off before dressing in the borrowed garments. They were indeed a bit short, as she had predicted, but they were warm and dry, which was all that mattered. When he emerged, Delilah was at the small stove, waiting for a kettle to boil. She had removed her damp outer layers as well, and now wore a simple house dress of pale blue cotton. Her dark hair, which had begun to escape its pins during their adventure, was now neatly braided over one shoulder. "Feel better?" she asked, glancing up at him. "Much," Wyatt admitted, running a hand through his damp hair. "Thank you for your hospitality, Miss Vaughn. Please call me Delilah," she said, pouring hot water into a teapot. "After what we've been through today, formalities seem unnecessary." Wyatt smiled, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners. "Delilah it is, then." They settled at a small table, and Delilah poured tea into 2 chipped but pretty cups. For a moment they drank in silence, both processing the events of the day. "Those men," Wyatt finally said. "Do you know their names?" Delilah shook her head. "I've seen the scarred one in town occasionally, but we've never spoken before today." "I think I know who they work for," Wyatt said, his expression grim. "A man named Victor Denton. He owns the largest cattle operation in these parts, but rumor has it he's got his fingers in less savory business too, lending money at impossible interest rates, then collecting through intimidation." Delilah frowned. "You seem to know a lot about the area for someone who's just passing through." Wyatt looked down at his tea as if debating how much to share. "I've been tracking Denton for a while," he finally admitted. "I'm not just a cowboy looking for work. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal." Delilah's eyes widened. "A marshal? Why didn't you say so?" "I'm working unofficially," Wyatt explained. "Denton has friends in high places. The local law won't touch him, and my superiors wanted more evidence before pursuing formal charges. So I've been investigating on my own time." "That's why you're here in Willow Creek," Delilah realized. "Not for work at all." Wyatt nodded. "Denton's operation is centered about 20 miles north of here, but he does business in town. I figured this would be a good place to gather information without attracting attention." "And then you got involved in a river brawl defending a woman you've never met," Delilah said with a small smile. "Not exactly keeping a low profile." Wyatt chuckled. "No, not my most discreet moment, but I couldn't just ride by." "I'm grateful you didn't," Delilah said softly, meeting his eyes across the table. Something passed between them then, a moment of connection that made her heart beat faster. Wyatt cleared his throat and looked away first. "Those men will report back to Denton. If he really believes your father owed him money, he won't give up easily." "What should I do?" Delilah asked, fear creeping back into her voice. "First, we need to find out if this debt is real. Do you have access to your father's business records?" Delilah nodded. "He kept a ledger in his desk downstairs. I've been maintaining it since he passed, but I never looked at the older entries." "That's our first step then," Wyatt said. If there was a legitimate loan, we'll find evidence of it. If not, his expression hardened. Then we're dealing with a simple extortion attempt. Delilah wrapped her hands around her teacup, drawing comfort from its warmth. And what then? I can't fight men like that. You won't have to, Wyatt promised. That's what I'm here for. The certainty in his voice reassured her. For the first time since her father's death, Delilah felt as though she wasn't facing her troubles alone. It was a comforting feeling, made all the more surprising by the fact that Wyatt Xavier was a virtual stranger. Yet somehow, he didn't feel like a stranger at all. The following morning dawned clear and bright, sunlight streaming through the small windows of Delilah's apartment. She had insisted that Wyatt stay the night, offering her father's room rather than sending him to the hotel with Denton's men potentially looking for him. Though he had protested at first, concerned for her reputation, practical considerations had won out. Delilah rose early and was already preparing breakfast when Wyatt emerged from the bedroom, his hair tousled from sleep, but his eyes alert. "Good morning," she greeted, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon onto the table. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in weeks," Wyatt admitted, taking a seat. "The life of a traveling lawman doesn't often include comfortable beds. Or decent meals, I'd imagine," Delilah said, setting a cup of coffee in front of him before joining him at the table with her own plate. Wyatt took a bite of the eggs and closed his eyes in appreciation. Definitely not meals like this. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, the events of the previous day creating an unusual intimacy between them despite their short acquaintance. "I need to open the shop soon," Delilah said, glancing at the small clock on the mantel. "Mrs. Hollister is coming for a fitting at 9, and she's never late." "I'll help you look through your father's ledger before she arrives," Wyatt offered. "The sooner we understand what we're dealing with, the better." After breakfast, they went downstairs to the shop. Delilah lit the lamps and pulled the heavy ledger from a drawer in her father's desk. She handed it to Wyatt, who began carefully examining the entries while she prepared the shop for the day's business. "Your father was meticulous," Wyatt commented, turning the pages slowly. "Every transaction is recorded in detail." "He believed in keeping careful records," Delilah said, arranging fabric samples on the cutting table. "Said it was the only way to run a proper business." Wyatt continued through the ledger, his brow furrowing as he concentrated. Finally, about halfway through the book, he paused. "Here," he said, turning the ledger so Delilah could see. 8 months ago, a loan of $200 from VD with a notation for inventory expansion. Delilah leaned over the desk, studying the entry. "That was when we started carrying finer fabrics from back east. Papa said it would help us attract a wealthier clientele." She frowned. "But I don't see any record of repayment." "The terms are noted here," Wyatt said, pointing to a small annotation. 5% interest per month, to be paid in full within 6 months. 5% per month, Delilah gasped. "That's highway robbery." "That's Denton's business model," Wyatt said grimly. "By those terms, your father would have owed $300 by the time 6 months had passed." "We don't have that kind of money," Delilah said, sinking into a chair. "Business has been good, but not that good, and after the funeral expenses." She trailed off, the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. Wyatt closed the ledger. "It's a legitimate debt, at least on paper, though the terms are predatory. Denton could potentially make a legal claim against the business." "So those men were right," Delilah said softly. "I do owe them money." "No," Wyatt said firmly. "What they did yesterday wasn't legal debt collection. It was attempted murder, and that gives us leverage." "What do you mean?" Denton prefers to keep his more ruthless methods hidden, Throwing a young woman into the river might raise questions even his friends in high places couldn't easily dismiss. Wyatt tapped his fingers on the ledger, thinking, "We need to find out exactly how much your shop is bringing in. Maybe we can negotiate a payment plan." "I can show you the recent accounts," Delilah offered, reaching for a smaller ledger in another drawer. Before she could retrieve it, however, the bell above the shop door jingled. Both Wyatt and Delilah looked up to see a woman in an expensive dress and an elaborate hat adorned with ostrich feathers enter the shop. "Good morning, Mrs. Hollister," Delilah said, quickly composing herself and moving to greet her customer. "Right on time for your fitting, Mrs. Hollister." A woman in her 40s with carefully maintained blonde hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, looked curiously from Delilah to Wyatt. "I didn't realize you had company, Miss Vaughn. Mr. Xavier is consulting on some business matters," Delilah said, hoping the explanation sounded plausible. Mrs. Hollister raised an eyebrow but didn't comment further. Instead, she removed her gloves and handed them to Delilah. "I do hope my gown is ready. The Founders' Day celebration is only a week away." "Of course," Delilah assured her. "I just need to make the final adjustments after today's fitting." She turned to Wyatt. "If you'll excuse us, Mr. Xavier, perhaps we can continue our discussion later." Wyatt nodded, understanding the dismissal. "I'll return this afternoon, Miss Vaughn." He tipped his hat to Mrs. Hollister. "Madam." As he left the shop, Delilah led Mrs. Hollister toward the fitting area at the back, conscious of the woman's curious gaze. "He seems quite handsome, your business consultant," Mrs. Hollister remarked with a knowing smile. Delilah felt a blush rise to her cheeks. "It's not what you think. Mr. Xavier is simply helping me sort out some inheritance matters left by my father." Mrs. Hollister hummed noncommittally. "Well, it's about time you had some male attention, my dear. A young woman running a business alone is such a precarious position." As Delilah helped Mrs. Hollister into the partially completed evening gown, she found her thoughts drifting to Wyatt. There was something about him, his quiet confidence, his unwavering sense of justice, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, that had begun to occupy a space in her mind that had long been filled only with worry and work. But those thoughts would have to wait. Right now, she had a business to run and a debt to address. The rest, whatever it might be, would have to come later. Wyatt spent the morning making discreet inquiries around town. He visited the bank, posing as a potential investor interested in local businesses. He stopped by the saloon, where loose tongues and gossip often revealed more than official sources. He even paid a visit to the sheriff's office, introducing himself as a cowboy new to the area, curious about local regulations. What he learned confirmed his suspicions. Victor Denton's influence extended throughout Willow Creek like a spider's web. The bank president spoke of him with cautious respect. The saloon patrons fell quiet at the mention of his name. And Sheriff Mills, a portly man with a perpetual sheen of sweat on his brow, became visibly nervous when Wyatt casually asked about the biggest ranch in the area. "Denton's a powerful man," the sheriff had said, his eyes darting to the door as if expecting the man himself to appear. "Brings a lot of business to town. Best to stay on his good side if you're planning to settle here." By midday, Wyatt had a clearer picture of what they were up against. Denton had built his empire through a combination of legitimate business, intimidation, and strategic alliances with local officials. Few dared to cross him openly, and those who did tended to encounter unfortunate accidents or suddenly decide to move to distant territories. As he walked back toward Delilah's shop, Wyatt found himself thinking about her more than the case. Her quiet courage in the face of danger, her determination to maintain her father's business. The way her eyes lit up when she spoke about her work, all of it had made an impression on him that went beyond professional interest. It had been a long time since Wyatt had allowed himself to think of any woman as more than a passing acquaintance. The life of a marshal meant constant travel and danger, hardly conducive to lasting relationships. Yet something about Delilah Vaughn had slipped past his carefully maintained defenses. Lost in thought, Wyatt almost missed the three men lounging against the wall of the general store across from Delilah's shop. Almost, but not quite. Years of training had honed his awareness of potential threats. He recognized two of them immediately, the scarred man and one of his companions from the bridge. The third was unfamiliar, but the way they were watching the dress shop sent a clear message. Denton's men were keeping an eye on Delilah. Wyatt adjusted his course, walking past the shop without entering. He tipped his hat to a lady passing by, maintaining a casual appearance while observing the men from the corner of his eye. They hadn't recognized him yet. His soaking in the river and the darkness had obscured his features yesterday, but it was only a matter of time. He continued down the street, turning at the corner and doubling back through an alley that led behind the row of shops. He entered Delilah's shop through the back door, finding her pinning a hem on a dress while a young girl, presumably her assistant, sorted through a box of buttons. Both looked up in surprise at his entrance. "Mr. Xavier," Delilah said, straightening. "I wasn't expecting you to use the back door." "We have company out front," Wyatt said quietly, nodding toward the street. "Denton's men are watching the shop." Delilah paled slightly but maintained her composure. "Jenny, would you mind checking the front window display? Make sure the blue silk is draped properly." The young assistant nodded and moved to the front of the shop, giving Wyatt and Delilah a moment of privacy. "What do they want?" Delilah asked in a hushed voice. "To intimidate you," Wyatt replied, "and possibly to catch me. I don't think they've connected me to yesterday's events yet, but they're keeping an eye out for anyone suspicious." "What should we do?" Wyatt considered their options. "For now, continue as normal. I'll stay out of sight. Once your shop closes for the day, we need to discuss our next steps." Delilah nodded, her face resolute despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "I close at 5. Most days, anyway." "I'll be here," Wyatt promised. He spent the remainder of the afternoon in Delilah's back workroom, reviewing her recent business ledger while she and Jenny attended to customers. The numbers confirmed what he had suspected. The shop was profitable, but modestly so. There was no way Delilah could pay the full amount Denton demanded without selling the business itself. At 5 o'clock, after the last customer had left and Jenny had gone home, Delilah locked the front door and drew the blinds. She found Wyatt still at the workroom table, surrounded by ledgers and papers. "Any revelations?" she asked, sinking into a chair across from him. "Your business is sound," Wyatt said. "Your father built something sustainable here, but the debt to Denton—" He shook his head. "Even with your current profits, it would take months to pay it off, especially with that interest rate." "So what do we do?" Delilah asked, twisting a loose thread from her sleeve around her finger. "We have 3 options," Wyatt said. "First, we could try to negotiate with Denton directly, offer a payment plan, appeal to his business sense rather than his thugs." "Would that work?" Wyatt's expression suggested he had doubts. "It might buy time. The second option is to gather enough evidence of his illegal activities, including the attempt on your life, to bring formal charges. With my position as a marshal, we could potentially bypass the local authorities." "But you said he has friends in high places," Delilah pointed out. "He does, which makes that route challenging." Wyatt leaned forward, his eyes intent. "The third option is more direct. I confront Denton's men, make it clear that you're under the protection of a U.S. Marshal, and warn them off." "That sounds dangerous," Delilah said, concerned. "All three options carry risk," Wyatt admitted. "But doing nothing is no longer an option. Those men at the river weren't making idle threats." Delilah was quiet for a moment, considering. "What would you do if you were in my position?" Wyatt met her gaze steadily. "I'd try negotiation first. Violence should always be the last resort, not the first." "Then that's what we'll do," Delilah decided. "We'll approach Denton directly." Wyatt nodded, impressed by her courage. "We'll ride out to his ranch tomorrow." Better to meet him on his territory. He'll feel more in control, which might make him more amenable to discussion. "Tomorrow, then," Delilah agreed, trying to sound more confident than she felt. They spent the evening preparing for the meeting, with Wyatt coaching Delilah on what to expect and how to respond to potential intimidation tactics. They also worked out how much she could realistically offer to pay each month based on the shop's income. As the night grew late, they moved their discussion upstairs to Delilah's apartment. The small space felt intimate in the lamplight, and more than once, Delilah found herself distracted by the way the light played across Wyatt's features, highlighting the strong line of his jaw and the intensity in his blue eyes. "You should get some rest," Wyatt finally said, noticing her stifle a yawn. "Tomorrow will be challenging." "What about you?" Delilah asked. "Will you stay here again?" Wyatt hesitated. "It might be safer. Denton's men know where you live now, and I don't like the idea of leaving you unprotected." "Then it's settled," Delilah said, rising from the table. "You'll take my father's room again." As she prepared for bed in her own room, Delilah found her thoughts filled with Wyatt. It seemed impossible that just 2 days ago he had been a complete stranger. Now, he was risking his safety, perhaps even his career, to help her. And beyond his assistance, there was something else growing between them, something she hadn't expected but couldn't deny. She fell asleep thinking of river blue eyes and the steady strength of his presence beside her. The ride to Denton's ranch the next morning was tense. Wyatt and Delilah set out early, hoping to reach the property before the heat of the day made travel uncomfortable. They rode side by side, mostly in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation ahead. Denton's ranch was impressive, spanning thousands of acres of prime grazing land. The main house was a sprawling 2-story affair with a wide porch and large windows, a statement of wealth and power in a territory where most homes were simple cabins. As they approached, Wyatt noticed at least 4 men patrolling the property, all armed. He motioned for Delilah to stay close to him as they rode up to the hitching post in front of the house. "Remember," Wyatt said quietly as they dismounted, "let me do most of the talking at first. When it comes to the financial details, that's your territory. Stay calm, no matter what he says or does." Delilah nodded, straightening her riding skirt and squaring her shoulders. She had dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a conservative but well-made traveling suit that projected both respectability and quiet confidence. They hadn't reached the porch steps when the front door opened. A man emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair at his temples and a neatly trimmed beard. He wore a tailored suit that would have looked more at home in an eastern city than a western territory, and a gold watch chain glinted against his vest. "Well now," he said, his voice cultured but with an undercurrent of steel, "I don't believe I was expecting visitors today. Victor Denton." He didn't offer his hand. "Wyatt Xavier," Wyatt introduced himself, deliberately omitting his title for now. "And this is Miss Delilah Vaughn. We've come to discuss a business matter." Recognition flashed in Denton's eyes at Delilah's name. "Miss Vaughn," he said, his gaze sharpening. Yes, I believe we do have some unfinished business to discuss. Please come inside. He led them into a lavishly furnished parlor, where a young man with Denton's features but none of his polish sat slouched in an armchair, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. "My son, James," Denton said briefly, not bothering to have the young man stand for the introduction. "James, these people are here on business. Why don't you make yourself useful elsewhere?" James cast a sullen look at his father but drained his glass and left without a word, brushing past Delilah with barely a nod. "Please sit," Denton said, gesturing to a pair of chairs. He remained standing, a subtle power play that Wyatt recognized but didn't challenge. "Now, what's this about? I assume it concerns your father's debt, Miss Vaughn." Delilah glanced at Wyatt, who gave her a slight nod of encouragement. "Yes, Mr. Denton," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I recently became aware that my father borrowed money from you before his passing. I've come to discuss repayment terms." Denton raised an eyebrow. "Recently became aware." "My men visited you months ago, shortly after your father's funeral. They made the situation quite clear." Delilah blinked in surprise. "No one came to see me about a debt until yesterday when 3 men tried to throw me into the Colorado River." Denton's expression darkened. "Is that so?" He turned to a sideboard and poured himself a small glass of amber liquid. "I find that difficult to believe, Miss Vaughn. I sent 2 of my men to speak with you in February. They reported that you refused to acknowledge the debt and threatened to involve the law." "That's a lie," Delilah said, color rising to her cheeks. "No one came to me in February or any other time before yesterday." Wyatt watched Denton carefully, noting the momentary confusion that crossed the man's face before it was replaced by his usual composure. There was something off about this situation. "Mr. Denton," Wyatt said, "it seems there may be some miscommunication among your employees. The men who approached Miss Vaughn yesterday were not interested in discussing repayment. Their stated intention was to, and I quote, send a message by drowning her in the river." Denton's eyes narrowed. "And how would you know this, Mr. Xavier? Were you present for this alleged encounter?" "I was," Wyatt confirmed. "In fact, I intervened when they attempted to carry out their threat. Perhaps you'd like to know that one of your men nearly drowned in the process. I pulled him from the river myself." "Did you indeed?" Denton studied Wyatt with new interest. "You seem to have involved yourself quite thoroughly in Miss Vaughn's affairs for someone who, as far as I know, is not related to her." "Mr. Xavier is assisting me with my father's estate," Delilah said smoothly, sticking to their agreed-upon story. "He has experience in financial matters." Denton didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he returned to the matter at hand. "Well, regardless of how we got here, the fact remains that your father borrowed $200 from me, Miss Vaughn. With interest, the amount now due is $320. The original agreement was for repayment within 6 months, Wyatt pointed out. That would have been $300. How do you justify the additional 20? "The 6-month term expired last month," Denton said coldly. "Interest continues to accrue at 5% monthly." "That's usury," Delilah said, unable to contain herself. Denton smiled thinly. "That's business, Miss Vaughn. Your father agreed to the terms. If you can't meet them, perhaps we should discuss alternatives." "Such as?" Wyatt asked, not liking the calculating look in Denton's eyes. "The dress shop itself would more than cover the debt," Denton suggested. "I have business interests in town that could use the space." "The shop isn't for sale," Delilah said firmly. "It was my father's legacy to me, and I intend to keep it." "Then how do you propose to pay what you owe?" Denton asked, his patience visibly thinning. Delilah straightened in her chair. I can pay $50 now and $30 per month until the debt is cleared. Based on my current business income, that's the most I can manage. Denton laughed, a short, humorless sound. That would take nearly 9 months to clear the current amount, during which time interest would continue to accumulate. Unacceptable. Then perhaps we should discuss a more reasonable interest rate, Wyatt suggested. 2% monthly would be far more in line with standard banking practices. I'm not a bank, Mr. Xavier, Denton said dismissively. I take risks that banks won't, and I expect to be compensated accordingly. The negotiation continued for nearly an hour, with offers and counteroffers flying back and forth. Finally, they reached a tentative agreement. Delilah would pay $100 immediately and the remaining $220 within 60 days, with no additional interest during that period. I'll have the paperwork drawn up, Denton said, rising to signal the end of the meeting. You can sign it when you bring the initial payment tomorrow. As they prepared to leave, Wyatt decided it was time to show his hand. One more thing, Mr. Denton, he said, reaching into his vest pocket and producing his marshal's badge. I'd appreciate it if you'd instruct your men to maintain a respectful distance from Miss Vaughn in the future. As a deputy U.S. Marshal, I take a dim view of threats against innocent citizens. Denton's face registered shock, then quickly shifted to careful neutrality. A marshal, he said softly. How interesting. Are you here in an official capacity, Deputy Xavier? Let's just say I have a professional interest in ensuring the law is upheld, Wyatt replied evenly. Attempted murder falls outside the bounds of legitimate debt collection, wouldn't you agree? Absolutely, Denton said, his tone suddenly cordial. And I assure you, if any of my men threatened Miss Vaughn in such a manner, they acted without my knowledge or approval. I'll look into the matter personally. See that you do, Wyatt said, replacing his badge. Good day, Mr. Denton. As they rode away from the ranch, Delilah waited until they were well out of earshot before speaking. Do you believe him? That he didn't order those men to harm me? Wyatt considered the question carefully. I'm not sure. Something doesn't add up about this whole situation. The men at the river were clearly following someone's orders, but Denton seemed genuinely surprised by some of what we told him. What are you thinking? Delilah asked, studying his troubled expression. I'm thinking there might be someone else involved, Wyatt said slowly. Someone using Denton's name and resources for their own purposes. Like who? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Wyatt glanced at Delilah, concern evident in his eyes. In the meantime, we need to figure out how you're going to come up with $320 in the next 2 months. Delilah sighed. I have nearly 100 saved. The rest, I don't know. I could sell some of our premium fabrics at a discount, take on more alterations work. We'll figure it out, Wyatt assured her. Together. The word hung between them, laden with meaning that extended beyond their current predicament. For the first time, both were acknowledging that whatever had brought them together, chance, fate, or simple human decency, had grown into something more substantial than either had anticipated. As they rode back toward town, the setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber, casting long shadows across the trail. Despite the challenges ahead, Delilah found herself drawing comfort from Wyatt's steady presence beside her. And Wyatt, who had spent years keeping people at a distance, found himself increasingly unwilling to contemplate a future that didn't include the brave dressmaker who had unexpectedly captured his attention, and perhaps his heart as well. The next few days fell into a pattern as Wyatt and Delilah worked to gather the money needed for Denton's payment. Delilah spent long hours in the shop, taking on extra alterations and rushing orders for customers willing to pay a premium for expedited work. Wyatt, meanwhile, continued his investigation, speaking with townspeople who might have information about Denton's operation, and keeping an eye out for the men who had attacked Delilah at the river. Wyatt had taken a room at the hotel to maintain appearances, but he spent most of his time either at the dress shop or patrolling nearby, ensuring Delilah's safety. He had sent a telegram to his superior in Denver, requesting information about any previous complaints against Denton, but had yet to receive a response. On the fourth day after their meeting with Denton, Wyatt entered the dress shop just as Delilah was saying goodbye to a customer. The woman, dressed in an elaborate walking costume that spoke of considerable wealth, smiled warmly at Delilah. "I'll send my daughter in next week for that fitting," the woman said, gathering her gloves. "Your work is exceptional, Miss Vaughn. I've told all my friends they simply must patronize your establishment." "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Blake," Delilah replied, walking the woman to the door. "I look forward to meeting your daughter." After the customer left, Delilah turned to Wyatt with a tired but genuine smile. "That's 3 new orders this week. If this keeps up, we might actually meet Denton's deadline." "That's good news," Wyatt said, removing his hat as he approached the counter. "You look exhausted, though. Have you been working straight through again?" Delilah brushed a strand of hair from her face. "There's too much to do to waste time on rest." "It's not a waste if it keeps you from collapsing," Wyatt said gently. "When was the last time you ate?" Delilah hesitated, trying to remember. "Breakfast, I think. Jenny brought me some bread and cheese." Wyatt shook his head, concerned. "It's nearly 5 o'clock. Come on, let's close up early and get some real food into you." "I can't," Delilah protested. "I still have to finish Mrs. Hollister's gown for tomorrow, and there's the invoice for the fabric delivery, and all of which will still be here after dinner." Wyatt interrupted. He moved around the counter and took her hands in his, a gesture that had become increasingly common between them over the past days. "1 hour, Delilah, that's all I'm asking." The warmth of his hands and the concern in his eyes broke through her determination. "All right," she conceded. 1 hour." Wyatt smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "Thank you." "There's a new restaurant that opened last month near the hotel. The owner's wife is from New Orleans, and word around town is that her cooking is worth the trip." "That sounds wonderful," Delilah admitted, realizing how hungry she actually was. "Let me just put the closed sign up and get my shawl." As they walked together through the early evening streets, Delilah was acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople they passed. Willow Creek wasn't large enough for regular appearances together to go unnoticed, and she knew gossip about their relationship was likely already circulating. "People are watching us," she murmured to Wyatt. "Let them," he replied easily. "We're not doing anything wrong." "My reputation is above reproach," Wyatt finished for her. "You're a respected businesswoman being escorted to dinner by a law enforcement officer. There's nothing scandalous about that." Delilah smiled at his matter-of-fact assessment, though she knew the reality was more complicated. An unmarried woman spending time with a single man, regardless of his profession, was bound to raise eyebrows in a small town like Willow Creek. But at that moment, with Wyatt's solid presence beside her and the prospect of a decent meal ahead, she found it difficult to care about the whispers. The restaurant was small but welcoming, with checkered tablecloths and the enticing aroma of spices unfamiliar to the frontier. They were seated at a corner table, and Wyatt ordered for both of them after a brief consultation with the proprietor. "You seem to know your way around a menu," Delilah observed after the man left to prepare their meal. Wyatt smiled. "I've traveled enough to appreciate good food when I find it. The Marshal service has taken me all over the Western Territories. It must be an interesting life, Delilah said, genuinely curious. Seeing new places, meeting different people. Interesting, yes. Comfortable, no. Wyatt's expression turned thoughtful. There are nights spent in the rain, days without a proper meal, weeks of tracking someone across wilderness with only your horse for company. Sounds lonely, Delilah said softly. Wyatt met her eyes. It can be, but it has its rewards. Knowing you've made a difference brought justice where there was none. Is that why you became a marshal, to bring justice? Wyatt was quiet for a moment, as if deciding how much to share. Partly, he finally said. My father was a sheriff in a small Kansas town. He was killed trying to stop a bank robbery when I was 16. The men who did it were never caught. His voice had grown distant, recalling memories long buried. When I was old enough, I joined the Marshal service. Thought maybe I could do for others what no one had done for my family, bring closure, make sure those who commit crimes face consequences. Delilah reached across the table and placed her hand over his. I'm sorry about your father. Wyatt turned his hand over, his fingers interlacing with hers. It was a long time ago. What about you? Did you always want to be a dressmaker? The arrival of their food interrupted the moment, but the connection between them remained, a tangible thing that neither could deny. Over bowls of rich, fragrant stew and crusty bread, Delilah told Wyatt about her childhood, about learning to sew at her mother's knee, about her father's decision to open the shop after her mother died of influenza. He knew nothing about dresses or fabrics, she said with a fond smile, but he knew business. He handled the books and the ordering, and I did the creative work. We made a good team. You must miss him terribly, Wyatt said. Every day, Delilah admitted. Especially now, with all this happening. He always knew what to do in a crisis. You're doing pretty well yourself, Wyatt pointed out. Most people would have crumbled under the pressure you're facing. Delilah blushed at the praise. I don't have much choice but to keep going. That's not true, Wyatt said seriously. You could have sold the shop to Denton, taken the easy way out, but you're fighting for what's yours. That takes courage. Their conversation flowed easily through the meal, touching on everything from Wyatt's most challenging cases to Delilah's dreams for expanding her business someday. By the time they finished dessert, a sweet pastry filled with fruit and drizzled with honey, more than an hour had passed, though neither had noticed the time. As they walked back toward the dress shop in the gathering dusk, Delilah felt a contentment she hadn't experienced in months, perhaps years. Despite the threat hanging over her, despite the exhaustion and worry, this evening with Wyatt had reminded her that there was more to life than just survival. Thank you, she said as they approached the shop. You were right about needing a break. My pleasure, Wyatt replied, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back as they walked. We should make it a regular occurrence. The implication that he would be around for regular occurrences wasn't lost on Delilah, and she found herself hoping it would be true, even as she reminded herself that Wyatt's job would eventually take him elsewhere. As they reached the shop door, Delilah turned to face him, words of gratitude on her lips. But before she could speak, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A rider was galloping down the street toward them, his horse lathered with sweat from hard riding. The man pulled his mount to a stop in front of them, dust billowing from beneath the horse's hooves. Deputy Xavier, he called, breathing hard. Wyatt stepped forward, instantly alert. That's me. Telegram from Denver, the rider said, extending a folded paper. Marked urgent. Station master sent me to find you. Wyatt took the telegram, thanking the rider with a nod. As the man rode away, Wyatt unfolded the paper, his expression growing grim as he read its contents. What is it? Delilah asked, concern replacing the contentment of moments before. "Trouble," Wyatt said tersely. "Let's get inside." Once in the shop with the door locked behind them, Wyatt handed the telegram to Delilah. "It's from my superior in Denver. He's been investigating Denton for months, gathering evidence of fraud, extortion, and possibly worse." Delilah scanned the message, her brow furrowing. "It says there's no record of any Victor Denton owning a cattle operation before 3 years ago, that he appeared in the territory with significant wealth of unknown origin." "Keep raiding," Wyatt said grimly. Delilah's eyes widened as she continued. "They think he might be William Donovan, the bank robber." She looked up at Wyatt in shock. "The one who killed your father," Wyatt nodded, his jaw tight. "The description matches, and the timing of Denton's appearance in the territory aligns with Donovan's disappearance back east. They've sent a federal marshal to investigate further, but he won't arrive for at least a week. What does this mean for us?" Delilah asked, handing the telegram back to Wyatt. "It means we need to be even more careful," Wyatt said, pocketing the paper. "If Denton is really Donovan, he's more dangerous than I thought. And if he suspects, I'm investigating him specifically rather than just protecting you." "He might come after you," Delilah finished, fear evident in her voice. "Or use you to get to me," Wyatt said quietly, the possibility clearly distressing him. "I shouldn't have involved you in this." "You didn't involve me," Delilah reminded him. "I was already involved when you found me on that bridge." She reached for his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "We'll face this together, just like we agreed." Wyatt looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face, his expression softening. "You are remarkable, Delilah Vaughn." In that moment, with the shop quiet around them and the weight of new revelations settling between them, something shifted. Wyatt stepped closer, his free hand coming up to gently cup Delilah's cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Delilah," he said softly, her name a question and a plea all at once. She answered by rising on her toes, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that started gentle but quickly deepened. Months of loneliness and days of growing attraction culminating in this moment of connection. Wyatt's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as Delilah's hands found their way to his shoulders, then his neck, finally threading through his hair. The world around them faded away, all thoughts of danger temporarily forgotten in the discovery of each other. When they finally parted, both breathless, Wyatt rested his forehead against hers. "I didn't plan for this," he admitted quietly. "Neither did I," Delilah replied, a small smile playing at her lips. "But I'm not sorry it happened." "Nor am I," Wyatt said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "But it complicates things." "Life is complicated," Delilah said simply. "That doesn't mean we should shy away from the good parts when they come along." Wyatt smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and transformed his face. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," Delilah teased. "You're just noticing now." Their moment of levity was short-lived, however, as reality reasserted itself. Wyatt reluctantly stepped back, though he kept hold of Delilah's hand. "We need to make a plan," he said, his mind clearly returning to the threat posed by Denton. "With this new information, I can't in good conscience let you deliver that payment tomorrow as agreed." "But if I don't, he'll have cause to come after me legitimately," Delilah pointed out. "There's nothing legitimate about what he's doing," Wyatt countered. "If he really is Donovan, the money he lent your father was likely stolen to begin with." They debated their options late into the evening, finally deciding that Delilah would keep the appointment with Denton, but that Wyatt would accompany her openly as a marshal, not just as a friend. They would pay the agreed-upon first installment to avoid immediate repercussions. But Wyatt would make it clear that he was monitoring the situation closely. As they prepared to part for the night, Wyatt returning to his hotel room for appearances' sake, he pulled Delilah into one more embrace, his kiss a promise and a warning all at once. "Be careful," he murmured against her hair. "If anything seems wrong, anything at all, send word to me immediately." "I will," Delilah promised. "You be careful too." As she watched him walk away, Delilah was struck by how thoroughly Wyatt Xavier had upended her carefully ordered existence in less than a week. From the moment he had leapt into the river to save her, her life had been irrevocably changed, and not just because of the danger they now faced together. For the first time since her father's death, she wasn't facing the world alone. And despite the threats surrounding them, that knowledge brought a comfort she hadn't realized she'd been missing. The following morning dawned clear and bright, belying the tension that had settled over Willow Creek. Delilah dressed with particular care, choosing a practical but well-made traveling suit that projected confidence and respectability. The $100, nearly all her savings, was secured in an inner pocket of her jacket. Wyatt arrived at the shop just after 9, dressed in his Marshal's uniform, his badge prominently displayed on his vest. The sight of him caused Delilah's heart to skip a beat, both from the memory of their kiss the previous evening and from the gravity of what lay ahead. "Are you ready?" he asked, his eyes taking in her appearance with appreciation despite the seriousness of the moment. "As ready as I'll ever be," Delilah replied, gathering her gloves and reticule. They had agreed to meet Denton at the bank in town, rather than returning to his ranch, a neutral location that provided a modicum of safety through its public nature. As they walked side by side down the main street, Delilah was conscious of the curious glances from townspeople, now intensified by Wyatt's official appearance. The bank was a solid brick building at the center of town, its imposing facade designed to inspire confidence in its stability. As they climbed the steps to the entrance, Delilah felt Wyatt's hand at the small of her back, a reassuring presence that steadied her nerves. Inside, the bank manager, Mr. Phillips, greeted them with nervous deference, his eyes flickering between Wyatt's badge and the door as if expecting trouble. "Deputy Xavier, Miss Vaughn, Mr. Denton is waiting in the private consultation room." He led them to a small office at the rear of the building, where Victor Denton sat behind a polished desk, papers spread before him. He looked up as they entered, his expression betraying momentary surprise at Wyatt's official attire, before smoothing into practiced affability. "Deputy Xavier, Miss Vaughn, right on time." He gestured to the chairs across from him. "Please sit." As they took their seats, Denton's gaze lingered on Wyatt's badge. "I see you've decided to make this an official visit, Deputy. Is there a particular reason for that?" "Just ensuring everything is above board," Wyatt replied evenly. "As you know, I take a professional interest in Miss Vaughn's situation." Denton smiled thinly. "Of course. Well, let's proceed, shall we?" He pushed a document across the desk. "The agreement we discussed. $100 today, with the remaining $220 due within 60 days. No additional interest during that period." Delilah reviewed the document carefully, conscious of Wyatt doing the same beside her. The terms matched their verbal agreement, though the interest rate after the 60-day period would revert to the original 5% monthly if the debt wasn't settled in full. "It appears to be in order," she said, reaching into her jacket for the money. She counted out the $100 on the desk, each bill representing countless hours of work. Denton made no move to touch the money. Instead, he slid a pen toward Delilah. "If you'll just sign the agreement, we can complete our business." Delilah took the pen, hesitating only briefly before signing her name at the bottom of the document. Denton countersigned with a flourish, then finally gathered the money, counting it methodically before tucking it into his vest pocket. "A pleasure doing business with you, Miss Vaughn," he said, his tone suggesting the opposite. His gaze shifted to Wyatt. "Deputy Xavier, might I have a word in private before you leave?" Wyatt glanced at Delilah, a silent question in his eyes. She nodded slightly, understanding the need for him to gather whatever information he could. "I'll wait for you outside," she said, rising from her chair. Once Delilah had left the room, Denton's demeanor changed subtly, the affable businessman replaced by something colder and more calculating. "What is your real interest in this matter, Deputy?" he asked without preamble. "A minor debt dispute hardly seems worth the attention of a federal marshal. As I said, I take an interest in ensuring justice is served," Wyatt replied, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts. "Especially when innocent citizens are threatened with violence. Ah, yes, this alleged attempt on Miss Vaughn's life." Denton leaned back in his chair, studying Wyatt with narrowed eyes. "A disturbing claim, if true. I've spoken with my men, and they deny any such incident." "I witnessed it myself," Wyatt said flatly. 3 men attempted to throw her from the bridge into the Colorado River. One of them bears a distinctive scar from his right eye to his jaw. Perhaps you're familiar with him." A flicker of something recognition, perhaps, or irritation crossed Denton's face before he controlled his expression. "I employ many men, Deputy. I can't be expected to remember every face." "This one would be memorable," Wyatt pressed, "especially since he nearly drowned in the river himself." Denton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If any of my employees engaged in such behavior, they did so without my knowledge or approval. I run a legitimate business, Deputy Xavier. I have no need for such crude methods." "I'm glad to hear it," Wyatt said, rising from his chair. "Then you won't object to my continued presence in Willow Creek, ensuring Miss Vaughn's safety until this matter is fully resolved?" "Not at all," Denton replied smoothly, though his eyes had hardened to flint. "Though I must wonder if your superiors approve of your personal involvement in this case." The implication was clear, and Wyatt felt a surge of anger that he carefully controlled. "My superiors are fully aware of my activities," he said, a partial truth at best. "Good day, Mr. Denton." As he turned to leave, Denton's voice stopped him at the door. "One more thing, Deputy. Where are you from originally?" The seemingly innocuous question carried a weight that Wyatt understood immediately. "Kansas," he answered truthfully, turning back to meet Denton's gaze directly. "A small town you've probably never heard of." Denton smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "You'd be surprised at the places I've been, Deputy Xavier, very surprised indeed." The exchange left Wyatt unsettled as he joined Delilah outside the bank. The implicit threat in Denton's words, combined with his pointed question about Wyatt's origins, suggested that the man might indeed be William Donovan, and that he might suspect Wyatt's personal interest in his identity. "What happened?" Delilah asked quietly as they walked away from the bank. "You look troubled." "Denton knows more than he's letting on," Wyatt replied, keeping his voice low, "and I think he's beginning to connect the dots about who I am and why I'm really here." "That's dangerous," Delilah said, concern evident in her voice. "Very," Wyatt agreed. "Which is why we need to accelerate our plans. We can't wait for the federal marshal to arrive next week. By then, Denton could disappear or worse." They spent the remainder of the day gathering what evidence they could. Wyatt visited the land office, confirming that Victor Denton had purchased his ranch 3 years earlier, paying in cash. He spoke with the telegraph operator, who revealed that Denton sent and received an unusual number of encrypted messages to contacts in various cities. Meanwhile, Delilah discreetly asked questions among her customers, particularly the wives of prominent citizens who might have attended social functions at Denton's ranch. She learned that the man was generous with his hospitality, but guarded about his past, deflecting questions about his life before arriving in Arizona territory. By late afternoon, they had assembled a compelling, if circumstantial, case suggesting that Victor Denton was not who he claimed to be. Whether he was specifically William Donovan remained to be proven, but the pattern of deception was clear. As they sat in the back room of Delilah's shop, reviewing their findings, Wyatt found himself continually distracted by Delilah's presence. Despite the seriousness of their situation, he couldn't help noticing the way the late afternoon sun caught in her hair, or how her brow furrowed in concentration as she studied the notes they'd made. "You're staring," Delilah observed without looking up, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Can you blame me?" Wyatt replied, not bothering to deny it. Delilah finally raised her eyes to meet his, her expression softening. "We should be focusing on Denton." "I know," Wyatt sighed, "but it's hard to focus when you're sitting there looking, like you." The compliment brought a blush to Delilah's cheeks. "Well, Mr. Xavier, you'll have to try harder. We have a potential bank robber and murderer to expose." Wyatt nodded, forcing his attention back to their notes. "You're right. Based on what we've gathered, I think we have enough to justify detaining Denton for questioning when the federal marshal arrives. The problem is keeping him here until then." "Do you think he suspects you're onto him?" Delilah asked, "after our conversation today?" "Yes." Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Delilah had come to recognize as a sign of frustration. "He asked where I was from, specifically, and the way he said it. It was like he was testing me." "What will you do now?" Wyatt considered their options carefully. "I could try to arrest him myself, but without solid proof that he's Donovan, it would be difficult to make it stick. And if I'm wrong, I could jeopardize my position as a marshal. Not to mention putting yourself in danger," Delilah pointed out. "Denton or Donovan, whoever he is, has a lot of men working for him. You can't take them all on alone." "No," Wyatt agreed. "But I can keep watching him, make it clear that I'm not going anywhere. If he is Donovan, he's managed to stay hidden for years by being cautious. He won't risk exposure by doing anything too obvious while he knows I'm watching." "Unless he decides you're too much of a threat," Delilah said quietly. "In which case—" She didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what men like Denton did to threats. "I've faced dangerous men before," Wyatt assured her, reaching across the table to take her hand. "This is my job, Delilah. It's what I've trained for." "I know," she said, squeezing his hand, "but that doesn't stop me from worrying about you." The admission hung between them, simple yet profound in what it revealed about Delilah's feelings. Wyatt lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "I'll be careful," he promised, "for both our sakes." As the evening deepened into night, they finalized their plan. Wyatt would maintain a visible presence in town, making it clear that he was watching Denton's operation closely. Delilah would continue gathering information from her customers, while also working to raise the remaining money for the debt payment, a practical necessity, even as they sought to expose Denton's true identity. When it came time for Wyatt to leave, they stood in the darkened shop, reluctant to part despite the late hour. "I should go," Wyatt said, though he made no move toward the door. "People will talk if I'm seen leaving here too late." "Let them talk," Delilah said softly, stepping closer to him. "I don't care anymore." Wyatt's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "You might care when this is all over," he pointed out. "When life goes back to normal." "Nothing will ever be normal again," Delilah replied, her hands resting on his chest. "Not after meeting you." The simple truth of her words struck Wyatt deeply. His own life had been irrevocably changed as well, though he hadn't fully acknowledged it until this moment. For years, he had defined himself by his quest for justice, by the memory of his father's murder and his determination to bring the killers to account. Now, suddenly, there was more. There was Delilah with her courage and determination, her gentle strength and surprising humor. There was the possibility of a future that included more than just the next case, the next town, the next criminal to track. "Delilah," he began, not entirely sure what he wanted to say, but feeling the need to express something of the turmoil in his heart. She silenced him with a kiss, rising on her toes to press her lips to his. Wyatt responded immediately, one hand moving to cradle the back of her head as he deepened the kiss, pouring all his unspoken feelings into the connection between them. When they finally parted, both breathless, Delilah rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath his vest. "Whatever happens with Denton," she said quietly, "we'll face it together. And after." "After," Wyatt repeated, the word a promise he wasn't sure he could keep but desperately wanted to. "Yes, after." With one final kiss, gentler than the last but no less meaningful, Wyatt forced himself to leave, knowing that staying longer would only make parting harder. As he walked through the quiet streets toward his hotel, his mind was divided between thoughts of Delilah and the danger that still lay ahead. He was so distracted that he almost missed the shadowy figure following him, keeping to the darkness between buildings. Almost, but not quite. Years of training had honed Wyatt's instincts too well to be completely overcome, even by thoughts of Delilah. Without altering his pace or giving any indication that he was aware of being followed, Wyatt continued toward the hotel, his hand casually moving closer to his holstered revolver. When he reached the corner where the main street intersected with the road leading to the hotel, he suddenly ducked into the alley between the general store and the barber shop. His pursuer, caught off guard by the unexpected move, hesitated momentarily before following. That brief hesitation was all Wyatt needed. As the man entered the alley, Wyatt stepped out from behind a stack of crates, his revolver drawn and aimed. "That's far enough," Wyatt said, his voice low and steady. "Hands where I can see them." The man froze, slowly raising his hands. In the dim light spilling from a nearby window, Wyatt could make out his features young, perhaps early 20s, with a nervous expression that suggested he wasn't accustomed to this kind of work. "Who are you?" Wyatt demanded. "And why are you following me?" "James Denton," the young man stammered. "Mr. Denton's son." Wyatt's eyes narrowed. He recognized the sullen young man from their visit to Denton's ranch. "That doesn't answer my second question." James swallowed visibly. "My father sent me to keep an eye on you." "Why?" "He didn't say," James replied, his voice steadying somewhat. "Just told me to follow you, see where you went, who you talked to." Wyatt studied the young man carefully, trying to gauge whether he was telling the truth. "Your father must trust you a great deal to give you such a task." A bitter laugh escaped James's lips. "Trust me, he doesn't trust anyone, certainly not his failure of a son." There was resentment in his voice, deep and long-standing. "He probably just figured you wouldn't notice me. That's how little he thinks of my abilities." "Yet here we are," Wyatt observed dryly. "Me noticing you quite clearly." James's shoulders slumped slightly. "Just another disappointment to add to the list. Go ahead, arrest me or whatever you're going to do. It doesn't matter." The young man's dejection seemed genuine, and Wyatt found himself wondering how much James knew about his father's activities, and whether he might be a potential ally rather than an enemy. "I'm not going to arrest you," Wyatt said, lowering his gun slightly though not holstering it. "Not yet, anyway, but I do have some questions about your father," James tensed. "What kind of questions? How long have you known him?" Wyatt asked, the question deliberately provocative. "Known him," James repeated, confused. "He's my father. I've known him my whole life." "Have you?" Wyatt pressed. "Where were you born, James? Where did you live before coming to Arizona Territory 3 years ago?" The young man's expression shifted from confusion to wariness. "Why do you want to know that?" "Humor me," Wyatt suggested, his tone making it clear it wasn't really a suggestion. James hesitated, then sighed. "St. Louis. We lived in St. Louis before coming here. And before that, Chicago," James said, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. "I think. We moved around a lot when I was younger." Wyatt nodded, filing away the information. The locations matched what was known about Donovan's movements after the Kansas bank robbery. "One more question. Your father's name, has it always been Victor Denton?" At this, James's eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he controlled his expression. "What are you implying, Deputy?" "I think you know exactly what I'm implying," Wyatt said quietly. "The question is, do you know who your father really is?" For a long moment, James was silent, internal conflict evident in his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I should go." "James," Wyatt said, taking a step closer, "if you know anything about your father's true identity, now is the time to speak up. I can protect you." "No one can protect me from him," James replied, a tremor in his voice. "Please just let me go. Forget you saw me." Wyatt hesitated, weighing his options. Detaining James might provide leverage against Denton, but it could also provoke the man into hasty action that might endanger Delilah or others in town. And if James truly was afraid of his father, forcing his cooperation could backfire. "Go," Wyatt finally said, stepping aside. "But remember, if you ever want to talk, I'll listen, without judgment." James looked startled by the offer, as if unused to such consideration. He nodded once, then hurried past Wyatt and out of the alley, disappearing into the night. Wyatt remained where he was for several minutes, replaying the conversation in his mind. James's reactions had been telling, particularly his response to the question about his father's name. The young man knew something, perhaps not the full truth, but enough to be wary of questions about Denton's identity. It was another piece of the puzzle, another indication that Victor Denton was not who he claimed to be. The question remained whether he was specifically William Donovan, the man Wyatt had been hunting for years, or some other criminal using a false identity. Either way, the encounter with James confirmed that Denton was now actively monitoring Wyatt's movements. The game had escalated, and the danger along with it. With a grim determination, Wyatt continued to his hotel, more alert than before. He needed rest, but he also needed to be ready for whatever came next. The showdown with Denton or Donovan was coming, perhaps sooner than he had anticipated. And when it did, he would need all his wits about him, not just for his own sake, but for Delilah's as well. The following day brought an unexpected development that changed everything. Wyatt had just finished breakfast at the hotel when a telegram arrived from his superior in Denver. "Federal Marshal delayed stop, proceed with caution, stop. Additional information confirms Denton likely Donovan, stop, arrest warrant authorized, stop, backup en route, but at least 4 days out, stop." Wyatt read the message twice, weighing the implications. He now had the authority to arrest Denton on suspicion of being William Donovan, but doing so without backup was risky at best, suicidal at worst. Denton had at least a dozen armed men working for him, and the local sheriff was unlikely to provide assistance given his apparent deference to the rancher. Still, The confirmation that Denton was likely Donovan changed the calculus. After years of searching, Wyatt was finally close to bringing his father's killer to justice. The thought was both exhilarating and sobering. His first instinct was to go directly to Delilah with the news, but caution made him reconsider. After his encounter with James the previous night, he had to assume he was being watched. Leading Denton's men straight to Delilah would only put her in more danger. Instead, Wyatt went about his day with deliberate normalcy, visiting the sheriff's office to check in, stopping by the general store for supplies, and spending time at the saloon where he could observe the comings and goings of townspeople while appearing to simply enjoy a quiet drink. It was mid-afternoon when he finally made his way to Delilah's shop, taking a circuitous route and doubling back several times to ensure he wasn't followed. He entered through the back door, finding Delilah at her workroom table, measuring fabric for a new creation. She looked up at his entrance, a smile lighting her face before she registered his serious expression. "What's happened?" Wyatt handed her the telegram without preamble. "It's confirmed. Denton is almost certainly Donovan." Delilah read the message quickly, her eyes widening. "You're going to arrest him?" "I have to," Wyatt said, though the conflict was evident in his voice. "It's what I've worked toward for years. But doing it alone is dangerous, and waiting for backup means giving him 4 more days to potentially flee or worse." "You're not alone," Delilah said firmly, setting the telegram aside. "You have me." Wyatt shook his head, though her words touched him deeply. "I appreciate that, but this isn't your fight, and I won't put you in harm's way." "It became my fight when those men tried to throw me in the river," Delilah reminded him, "and when Denton or Donovan tried to take my shop. Besides—" She paused, reaching for his hand. "What matters to you matters to me." The simple declaration struck Wyatt speechless for a moment. In the space of less than 2 weeks, Delilah Vaughn had become more important to him than he would have believed possible. The thought of her in danger was unacceptable, but the realization that she cared for him so deeply was equally overwhelming. "Thank you," he finally managed. "But I still need to keep you safe. Denton knows I'm investigating him now. His son was following me last night." Delilah's alarm was immediate. "James, what happened?" Wyatt quickly recounted his conversation with the young man. "He knows something about his father's true identity, but he's too afraid to talk. Still, the encounter confirmed that Denton is watching me closely." "Which means he might be watching me too," Delilah realized. "Exactly. And that's why we need to be extremely careful about our next move." Wyatt began pacing the small workroom, thinking aloud. "If I try to arrest Denton at his ranch, I'll be outnumbered and on his territory. If I try to do it in town, there's the risk of innocent bystanders getting hurt if his men resist." "What about luring him somewhere?" Delilah suggested. "Somewhere you would have the advantage." Wyatt paused, considering the idea. "That could work, but he's too cautious to walk into an obvious trap. It would need to be something he couldn't resist, something important enough to make him take the risk." They fell into a thoughtful silence, each trying to devise a plan that wouldn't result in disaster. Finally, Delilah spoke, her voice hesitant. "What about me?" Wyatt's head snapped up. "What about you?" "He wants my shop," Delilah said slowly, the plan forming as she spoke. "What if I sent word that I've decided to sell after all, that I need the money immediately to leave town perhaps, something urgent that would make him act quickly?" "Absolutely not," Wyatt said flatly. "I won't use you as bait." "It makes the most sense," Delilah argued. "He already knows I'm connected to you, so he'd be suspicious of any other approach. But this would appeal to his greed, a chance to get my shop for less than the debt he claims I owe." "It's too dangerous," Wyatt insisted. "If anything went wrong—" "We would make sure nothing went wrong," Delilah countered. "We would control the meeting place, the timing, everything, and you would be there, hidden but ready." Wyatt ran a hand through his hair, torn between admiration for Delilah's courage and fear for her safety. "I don't like it." "I don't particularly like it either," Delilah admitted. "But I don't see a better option that doesn't involve you facing a dozen armed men alone." She had a point, and Wyatt knew it. A carefully controlled meeting with Delilah as the apparent bait, but actually serving as the lure could potentially work. Still, the thought of putting her in Denton's crosshairs, even momentarily, was deeply unsettling. "Let me think about it," he finally said. "There may be another way we haven't considered yet." But as the day wore on, and they discussed various alternatives, it became increasingly clear that Delilah's suggestion offered the best chance of success. By evening, they had reluctantly settled on a plan. Delilah would send a message to Denton, claiming that she had decided to sell the shop, but needed to complete the transaction quickly and discreetly. She would suggest meeting at the shop after hours, when the streets were quiet, and they could discuss terms privately. Wyatt would be hidden in the back room, armed and ready to make the arrest once Denton was inside. They would time the meeting for the following evening, giving them a full day to prepare, but not enough time for Denton to become suspicious or for his plans to change. "Are you sure about this?" Wyatt asked one final time as they finalized the details. "Once we set this in motion, there's no turning back." Delilah nodded, her expression resolute despite the fear Wyatt could see in her eyes. "I'm sure. I want this to be over one way or another. And I want you to have the closure you've been seeking all these years." Wyatt pulled her into his arms, holding her close as if he could somehow shield her from what was to come through sheer force of will. "When this is over," he murmured against her hair, "when Denton is in custody and you're safe, we need to have a serious conversation about the future." Delilah leaned back slightly to look up at him, hope and uncertainty mingling in her expression. "Our future." "Yes," Wyatt confirmed, the word a promise he intended to keep. "Our future." The kiss they shared then was both tender and passionate, a declaration of feelings too new and fragile to be fully expressed in words but no less real for their recent emergence. For a few precious moments, they allowed themselves to forget the danger, to imagine a life beyond the immediate threat hanging over them, but reality could only be held at bay for so long. As they reluctantly parted, the weight of their plan settled back upon them. Tomorrow would bring either resolution or disaster, and neither could predict with certainty which it would be. All they could do was prepare as thoroughly as possible and trust in each other, and in the justice they both sought, albeit for different reasons. The message was sent to Denton first thing the next morning, delivered by a boy from the telegraph office who was paid extra to take it directly to the ranch rather than transmitting it by wire. By noon, a reply had arrived. Denton would come to the shop at 8 that evening to discuss the sale. Wyatt and Delilah spent the day making meticulous preparations. They rearranged the workroom to provide Wyatt with adequate cover while maintaining a clear line of sight to the main shop area. They rehearsed various scenarios, including what Delilah would say to keep Denton talking until Wyatt could make his move. As a precaution, Wyatt also visited Sheriff Mills, informing him that he would be making an arrest that evening and might require assistance. The sheriff's reluctance was obvious, but he couldn't openly refuse a federal marshal's request for support without raising serious questions about his own loyalties. "I'll have a deputy nearby," Mills finally agreed, though his nervous demeanor suggested he was already planning how to warn Denton. "But I'm sure it won't be necessary. Willow Creek is a peaceful town." "Let's hope it stays that way," Wyatt replied, his tone making it clear he understood the sheriff's duplicity but was giving him one last chance to do the right thing. As evening approached, tension mounted. Delilah closed the shop at its usual time of 5 o'clock, then spent the next several hours pacing nervously and checking and rechecking their preparations. Wyatt, sensing her anxiety, took her hands in his, stilling her restless movement. "It's going to be all right," he assured her. "I won't let anything happen to you." "I'm not worried about myself," Delilah admitted. "I'm worried about you. If Denton suspects a trap if he brings his men." "He won't," Wyatt said with more confidence than he felt. "He's too arrogant to think he needs protection for a meeting with a dressmaker, and he'll want to keep this potential purchase quiet until it's finalized. Bringing men would attract attention." Delilah nodded, trying to take comfort in Wyatt's reasoning. "I just want this to be over." "Soon," Wyatt promised, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Just a few more hours and this will all be behind us." At 7:30, Wyatt took his position in the workroom, concealed behind a tall cabinet that afforded him a view of the main shop through a narrow gap. His revolver was loaded and ready, a spare gun tucked into his belt as a precaution. Delilah moved about the shop, lighting lamps to create a welcoming atmosphere while ensuring the window blinds were drawn to prevent anyone outside from observing what transpired within. She had changed into a simple but elegant dress of deep blue, projecting an image of calm competence despite the turmoil in her heart. At precisely 8 o'clock, a knock sounded at the shop door. Delilah took a deep breath, cast one final glance toward Wyatt's hiding place, then moved to answer it. Victor Denton stood on the threshold, impeccably dressed as always, his silver-touched hair neatly combed. He removed his hat as Delilah invited him inside, revealing a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "Miss Vaughn," he greeted her, "your message was quite a surprise. I was under the impression that you were determined to keep your shop at all costs." "Circumstances change," Delilah replied, gesturing for him to take a seat at the small table she had prepared near the counter. "Please, sit down. Can I offer you tea or perhaps something stronger?" Denton declined with a wave of his hand, settling into the chair with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Let's dispense with pleasantries, shall we? Your note mentioned an urgent need to sell. May I ask what's prompted this sudden change of heart?" From his hiding place, Wyatt tensed, hand on his weapon as he watched the interaction. So far, Denton was behaving exactly as they had anticipated, arriving alone, maintaining his businessman persona, getting straight to the point. Delilah took the seat across from Denton, folding her hands on the table to hide their slight tremor. "I've received word that my aunt in Boston is gravely ill. She raised me after my mother died and I need to go to her immediately. The shop, it's just a building in the end. Family is more important." It was the story they had concocted, designed to appeal to Denton's expectation that a woman would prioritize family obligations over business concerns. From Denton's thoughtful nod, it seemed he found the explanation plausible. "I understand completely," he said, his tone sympathetic though his eyes remained calculating. "Family must come first, of course, and I would be happy to take the shop off your hands, provide you with the funds you need for your journey and your aunt's care." "That's very kind," Delilah said, maintaining her composure with effort. "I thought, given our previous agreement about the debt, perhaps we could settle on a fair price that would clear what I owe you and provide enough for my travels and expenses in Boston." Denton smiled, the expression reminiscent of a predator scenting weakness. "A reasonable suggestion. What figure did you have in mind?" As Delilah named a sum deliberately modest to ensure Denton's interest, but not so low as to raise suspicion, Wyatt watched the man's face carefully. There was something in his expression, a hint of smugness that suggested he thought he was getting the better end of the deal. But there was something else too, a wariness in the set of his shoulders and the way his eyes occasionally flicked toward the windows. Denton was on guard, despite his outward calm. Whether that was simply his natural caution or an indication that he suspected a trap, Wyatt couldn't be certain, but it made him uneasy. The negotiation continued for several minutes, with Denton offering less than Delilah's asking price and Delilah countering with gentle but firm resistance. It was a convincing performance, with Denton gradually increasing his offer as Delilah appeared to become more desperate to complete the sale quickly. Finally, they settled on a figure that Denton produced from an inside pocket of his jacket. As he counted out the bills onto the table, he smiled at Delilah with false benevolence. "You've made a wise decision, Miss Vaughn. Running a business is a difficult undertaking for a woman alone. This will allow you to focus on more suitable pursuits." The condescension in his tone made Wyatt's jaw tighten, but Delilah merely nodded, playing her part perfectly. "If you'll just sign this bill of sale," she said, pushing a document across the table, "the shop will be officially yours." Denton took the paper, scanning it quickly before reaching for the pen Delilah offered. As he bent to sign, Wyatt made his move, stepping silently from his hiding place with his revolver drawn. "Victor Denton," he said, his voice steady and authoritative, "or should I say William Donovan? You're under arrest for the robbery of the First National Bank of Millfield, Kansas, and the murder of Sheriff Thomas Xavier." Denton froze, the pen hovering above the paper. Slowly, deliberately, he set it down and turned to face Wyatt, his expression a mask of controlled fury. "Deputy Xavier," he said, his voice dangerously soft. "I suspected this might be a trap, but I had to see for myself how far you would go." His gaze shifted to Delilah. "And you, Miss Vaughn, I must commend your acting abilities. You almost had me convinced." "Step away from her," Wyatt ordered, moving forward with his gun still trained on Denton. "Stand up and put your hands where I can see them." Denton complied with insulting slowness, rising from his chair and raising his hands to shoulder height. "You have no proof of these ridiculous allegations," he said. "Victor Denton is my legal name and has been for many years." "We have enough to hold you while we gather more evidence," Wyatt replied. "Your history before arriving in Arizona territory 3 years ago is suspiciously blank. And your son seems to have some interesting insights about your past identities." At the mention of James, a flash of genuine alarm crossed Denton's face before he controlled his expression. "Leave my son out of this. He knows nothing." "We'll let him speak for himself," Wyatt said, reaching for the handcuffs at his belt while keeping his revolver trained on Denton. "Delilah, move away from him." As Delilah started to comply, the shop door suddenly burst open. 3 men rushed in, guns drawn Denton's men, including the scarred man from the bridge. "Boss," the scarred man called. "You all right?" Wyatt immediately shifted position, keeping his gun on Denton but acutely aware of the new threat. "Drop your weapons," he commanded. "I'm a federal marshal making a lawful arrest." The men hesitated, looking to Denton for direction. With a subtle nod from their employer, they spread out, creating a triangle of armed men around Wyatt and Delilah. "It seems we have a standoff, Deputy," Denton observed calmly. "My men versus you." And Miss Vaughn caught in the middle. "I don't like those odds if I were you." Wyatt's mind raced, assessing options that all seemed equally dangerous. He could try to shoot Denton, but the other men would almost certainly fire in response, putting Delilah at risk. He could surrender, but that would likely mean death for both of them once Denton had them in his power. Before he could decide, The sound of shattering glass filled the room as the shop's front window exploded inward. A figure tumbled through the broken glass, rolling to a crouch with a revolver in each hand. "Nobody move!" James Denton shouted, his guns sweeping the room, covering his father's men rather than Wyatt or Delilah. The unexpected intervention created a moment of shocked silence. Denton recovered first, his face contorting with rage as he turned on his son. "James, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "The right thing," James replied, his voice steady despite the tremor visible in his hands. "For once in my life." "Lower your weapons," Wyatt ordered Denton's men again, seizing the opportunity created by James's appearance. Now, confusion reigned as the men looked from Denton to James and back, uncertain whose orders to follow. The scarred man started to lower his gun, then suddenly raised it again, aiming not at Wyatt but at James. "Don't listen to the boy," he growled. "Mr. Denton, give the word and we'll handle this." "No," Delilah cried, seeing the escalating danger. She lunged toward the scarred man, hoping to disrupt his aim. What happened next occurred in a blur of motion and sound. The scarred man shoved Delilah aside, causing her to crash into a display of fabrics. James fired at the man, the bullet grazing his shoulder. Wyatt, seeing Delilah fall, momentarily shifted his attention from Denton, who seized the opportunity to draw a concealed derringer from his sleeve. "Wyatt, look out," James shouted, but his warning came a fraction of a second too late. Denton fired, the small-caliber bullet striking Wyatt in the left shoulder. Pain exploded through him, but training and adrenaline kept him upright and focused. He returned fire, his bullet catching Denton in the right leg, dropping the older man to the floor with a cry of pain. The scarred man, seeing his employer fall, raised his gun to fire at Wyatt. Before he could pull the trigger, another shot rang out from James, who put a bullet squarely in the man's chest. The other two men, faced with their leader down and their comrade dying, finally dropped their weapons. Silence fell over the shop, broken only by the groans of the wounded and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Delilah struggled to her feet, rushing to Wyatt's side as he leaned against the counter, blood seeping through his shirt. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tight with fear as she pressed her hand to his wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "I'll live," Wyatt assured her, though the pain was intense. "Check on James." Delilah looked over at the young man, who still stood with his guns raised, though his hands were shaking visibly now. "James, are you all right?" James nodded jerkily, his eyes fixed on his father, who lay on the floor clutching his bleeding leg and glaring at his son with naked hatred. "Traitor," Denton spat. "My own blood turning against me." "You turned against me years ago," James replied, his voice surprisingly steady. "When you dragged me into your life of lies and crime, when you made me complicit in everything you did. I gave you everything." Denton shouted, his composure finally cracking. "A name, a position, a future, built on blood money," James said quietly. "I know what you did in Kansas, Father. I know about the sheriff you killed. I've always known." The admission hung in the air, confirming what Wyatt had suspected, that James had indeed known his father's true identity all along. The knowledge must have been a terrible burden for the young man, explaining his bitterness and his apparent emotional distance from his father. The sound of running footsteps outside heralded the arrival of Sheriff Mills and two deputies, drawn by the gunshots. They burst into the shop, weapons drawn, taking in the scene with wide eyes. "Marshal Xavier," Mills said, his gaze moving from the wounded Wyatt to Denton on the floor to the body of the scarred man. "What in God's name happened here?" "Justice happened," Wyatt said, straightening despite the pain. "Sheriff, I'm placing Victor Denton, also known as William Donovan, under arrest for bank robbery, murder, attempted murder, and fraud. His men are to be held as accomplices." Mills hesitated, looking uncertain, but the presence of witnesses, including James Denton, left him little choice but to comply. "Jenkins, Thompson, secure the prisoners," he ordered his deputies, "and someone fetch the doctor." As the deputies moved to handcuff Denton and his remaining men, Wyatt turned to James. "Thank you," he said simply. "Your intervention saved lives tonight." James lowered his guns at last, looking suddenly young and lost. "I should have spoken up sooner. Maybe then." He glanced at Delilah, still supporting the wounded Wyatt. "Maybe no one would have been hurt." "You spoke up when it counted," Delilah assured him. "That's what matters." The next few hours passed in a flurry of activity. The town doctor arrived to tend to the wounded, pronouncing the scarred man dead, but treating Wyatt's shoulder and Denton's leg. Sheriff Mills, perhaps sensing which way the wind was blowing, suddenly became cooperative, assisting in securing the prisoners and taking statements from all involved. By midnight, Denton and his surviving men were locked in the town jail. James had provided a sworn statement about his father's true identity and criminal activities, and Wyatt had sent telegrams to Denver reporting the arrest and requesting immediate support. Through it all, Delilah remained by Wyatt's side, refusing to leave even when the doctor suggested she go home and rest. Her shop was in disarray, with broken glass, bloodstains, and overturned furniture bearing witness to the violence that had erupted within its walls. But none of that seemed to matter to her as she sat beside Wyatt in the doctor's office, watching as his wound was cleaned and bandaged. "You could have been killed," she said softly, when they were finally alone, the doctor having stepped out to check on his other patient. "But I wasn't," Wyatt replied, reaching for her hand with his uninjured arm. "Thanks in large part to you and James." "I was so afraid," Delilah admitted, tears finally welling in her eyes now that the immediate danger had passed. "When I saw you get shot." "I know," Wyatt said, squeezing her hand. "I felt the same when that man pushed you. For a moment nothing else mattered, not Denton, not the arrest, nothing but making sure you were safe." The admission hung between them, a testament to how deeply their feelings for each other had grown in such a short time. Delilah leaned forward, resting her forehead against Wyatt's good shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence and the simple fact of his survival. "What happens now?" she asked after a long moment of silence. "Denton will be transferred to Denver as soon as he's well enough to travel," Wyatt explained. "He'll stand trial there first, and then likely be extradited to Kansas to face charges for my father's murder." "And us?" Delilah asked, the question encompassing far more than just their immediate plans. "What happens with us?" Wyatt reached up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite the firmness of his words. "Remember that conversation about the future I mentioned, the one we'd have when this was all over?" Delilah nodded, hope beginning to bloom in her heart. "I think it's time for that conversation," Wyatt said, his blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Delilah Vaughn, I've spent the past 10 years of my life chasing justice, moving from town to town, never staying long enough to put down roots. I thought that was all I needed or all I deserved." He paused, his thumb brushing across her cheek, wiping away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "And then I saw 3 men trying to throw a woman into a river, and I jumped in without thinking. And somehow, in less than 2 weeks, that woman has become the most important person in my life." "Wyatt," Delilah breathed, her heart pounding as she realized where his words were leading. "I love you," he said simply. "I know it's fast, maybe too fast. I know we've known each other under extraordinary circumstances that aren't like real life. But I know what I feel, and I think I hope you might feel the same." "I do," Delilah said, the words coming easily because they were true. "I love you too, Wyatt. I think I started falling for you the moment you pulled me away from that railing on the bridge." Wyatt smiled, the expression lighting his face despite the pain he must still be feeling from his wound. "Then here's what happens next, if you're willing. I take a leave of absence from the Marshal service. I stay in Willow Creek, help you repair your shop, and we see if what we feel for each other can grow roots in ordinary days, not just moments of danger and excitement." "And if it does?" Delilah asked, hardly daring to hope. "Then I find a more settled position, perhaps as a town marshal or sheriff somewhere nearby. Or maybe I leave law enforcement altogether and try my hand at something new." Wyatt's expression grew serious. "What I'm saying, Delilah, is that I want a future with you. However that looks, whatever shape it takes, I want us to face it together." Delilah felt tears of happiness spill over as she leaned in to kiss him, careful of his injured shoulder. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "That's what I want too." 3 months later, as summer gave way to the golden hues of autumn, Delilah stood in her newly repaired shop, putting the finishing touches on a wedding dress. Not her own, though the gold band on her left hand caught the light as she worked, a recent addition that still brought a smile to her face every time she noticed it. No, this dress was for Mrs. Blake's daughter, whose fitting was scheduled for later that afternoon. Business had never been better, partly due to the notoriety that had come from the dramatic events in the shop that night, but mostly because of the improvements Delilah had been able to make with her newfound financial security. Victor Denton, or William Donovan, as he was now officially known, had been convicted of multiple crimes and was currently awaiting trial in Kansas for the murder of Sheriff Thomas Xavier. His assets had been seized, and as part of the settlement, Delilah's debt had been not just forgiven but reversed. She had received compensation for the attempt on her life and the damage to her shop. James Denton, granted immunity for his testimony against his father, had left Willow Creek to start a new life under his own name, unburdened by his father's crimes. Before leaving, he had expressed his deep gratitude to Wyatt and Delilah for helping him find the courage to break free from his father's influence. The sound of the shop door opening drew Delilah from her thoughts. She looked up, smiling as Wyatt entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. He no longer wore a marshal's badge. He had resigned from the service after Donovan's conviction, deciding that his quest for justice had finally been fulfilled. Instead, he now served as Willow Creek's town marshal, a position that allowed him to continue upholding the law while remaining in one place. The arrangement suited him better than he had expected, especially since that place included Delilah. "How's the dress coming along?" he asked, crossing the shop to press a gentle kiss to her cheek. "Nearly finished," Delilah replied, setting aside her needle. "Just a few more details to add before the fitting." "How was your morning?" Wyatt said, which was typical for Willow Creek these days. With Donovan gone and his criminal enterprise dismantled, the town had returned to its usual peaceful state. "Had coffee with Sheriff Mills. He's talking about retiring next year." "Oh," Delilah raised an eyebrow, hearing the undercurrent in Wyatt's casual comment. "And did he happen to mention who might replace him?" Wyatt smiled, a hint of boyish shyness in the expression that still charmed Delilah every time she saw it. "He might have suggested I consider applying for the position. County sheriff would mean more responsibility, a bigger territory to cover. But also more stability," Delilah pointed out, "a more established position in the community." "Exactly what I was thinking," Wyatt agreed. "Especially considering—" He trailed off, his gaze dropping to Delilah's midsection, still flat but harboring a secret they had only recently confirmed. Delilah placed her hand over her abdomen, a protective gesture that had already become habit. "I think it's a wonderful idea. Our child should grow up with a father who's present, not constantly on the move." "Our child," Wyatt repeated, wonder in his voice as he covered her hand with his own. "I still can't believe it sometimes, that after everything, this is where we ended up." "Believing it is the easy part," Delilah said with a smile. "It's deserving it that's harder for you, isn't it?" Wyatt nodded, acknowledging the truth of her observation. After so many years defined by loss and the pursuit of justice, accepting happiness had been a challenge for him. But with Delilah's help, he was learning to embrace the future rather than remaining trapped in the past. "I'm getting better at that," he said. "Deserving it, I mean. Or at least believing that I might." "Good," Delilah replied, rising on her toes to kiss him properly. "Because you do deserve it. We both do." As they stood together in the shop that had nearly been lost and was now thriving, surrounded by the life they were building together and anticipating the new life that would join them in the months to come, Delilah couldn't help but marvel at how differently things might have turned out. If Wyatt hadn't happened to be crossing that bridge at the exact moment those men had tried to throw her into the river, if he hadn't been brave enough or perhaps impulsive enough to dive in and fight them all under the current, if they hadn't found in each other not just allies against a common enemy, but partners in a shared future. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important journeys began with a single, fateful plunge into unknown waters. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, those waters carried you not to destruction, but to the very place you were always meant to be. As the autumn sunlight streamed through the shop windows, illuminating their entwined figures, Delilah and Wyatt stood at the center of the life they had fought for, and won a life built on courage, justice, and a love that had begun in danger but would flourish in peace for many years to come.